Gastrointestinal motility. The time that food remains in each part of the alimentary canal is critical for optimal processing and absorption of nutrients. In addition, appropriate mixing must be provided because the requirement for mixing and propulsion are quite different at each stage of processing. Multiple automatic nerves and hormonal mechanisms control the timing of each of these activities so that they will occur optimally, not too rapidly and not too slowly. This chapter discusses these movements, especially the automatic mechanisms of this control. Functional types of movement in the gastrointestinal tract. Two types of movements occur in the gastrointestinal tract. Propulsive movements, which cause food to move forward along the tract at an appropriate rate to accommodate digestion and absorption. Propulsion movements or the propulsive movements, which causes the food to move forward along the tract at an appropriate rate to accommodate digestion and absorption. Then mixing movements, which keep the intestinal contents thoroughly mixed at all times. First one, propulsive movements or peristalsis. The basic propulsive movement of GI tract is peristalsis, which is very important. A contractile ring appears around the gut and then moves forward. This mechanism is analogous to putting one's finger around a thin distensible tube and then constricting the fingers and sliding them forward along the tube. Any material in front of the contractile ring is moved forward. Peristalsis is an inherent property of many syncytial smooth muscle tubes. It occurs in the bile ducts, glandular ducts, ureters, and many other smooth muscle tubes of the body. The usual stimulus for intestinal peristalsis is distension of the gut. Other stimuli that can initiate peristalsis include chemical or physical irritation of the epithelial lining in the gut. Also, strong parasympathetic nerve signals to the gut will elicit strong peristalsis. Then function of the myenteric plexus in peristalsis. Myenteric plexus in peristalsis. Peristalsis occurs only weakly or not at all in any portion of the GI tract that has congenital absence of the myenteric plexus. Also, it is greatly depressed or completely blocked in the entire gut when a person is treated with atropine to paralyze the cholinergic nerve endings of the myenteric plexus. Therefore, effectual peristalsis requires an active myenteric plexus. Myenteric plexus. Peristaltic waves move towards the anus with downstream receptive relaxation low of the gut. Peristalsis theoretically can occur in either direction from a stimulated point, but it normally dies out rapidly in the orad towards the mouth direction while continuing for a considerable distance toward the anus. The exact cause of this directional transmission of peristalsis has never been ascertained, although it probably results mainly from the fact that the myenteric plexus is polarized. Myenteric plexus is polarized in the anal direction, which can be explained as follows. When a segment of the intestinal tract is excited for distension and thereby initiates peristalsis, the contractile ring causing the peristalsis normally begins on the orad side of the distended segment and moves towards the distended segment, pushing the intestinal contents in the anal direction for 5 to 10 cm before dying out. At the same time, the gut sometimes relaxes several centimeters downstream toward the anus, which is called a receptive relaxation, allowing the food to be propelled more easily towards the anus than toward the mouth. This complex pattern does not occur in the absence of the myenteric plexus. Therefore, the complex is called a myenteric reflex. Myenteric reflex or peristaltic reflex. The peristaltic reflex or the myenteric plexus. Peristaltic reflex plus the anal direction of movement of the peristalsis is called the low of the gut. Mixing movements. Mixing movements differ in different parts of the alimentary tract. In some areas, the peristaltic contractions cause most of the mixing. This is specifically true when forward progression of The intestinal contents is blocked by a sphincter so that a peristaltic wave can then only turn the intestinal contents rather than propelling them forward. At other times, local intermittent constrictive contraction occurs every few centimeters in the gut wall. These constrictions promote the chopping and shearing of the contents. Ingestion of food. The amount of food that a person ingests is determined primarily by an intrinsic desire for food called hunger. The type of food that a person preferentially seeks is determined by appetite. The current discussion is confined to the mechanics of food ingestion, especially mastication and swallowing. Mastication or chewing. Chewing is important for digestion of all foods, but especially important for most fruits and raw vegetables because these have indigestible cellulose membranes around their nutrient portions that must be broken before the food can be digested. Also, the chewing aids the digestion of food for still another simple reason. Digestive enzymes act only on the surfaces of food particles. Therefore, the rate of digestion is absolutely dependent on the total surface area exposed to the digestive secretion. In addition, grinding the food to a very fine particulate consistency prevents excoriation of the GI tract and increases the ease at which food is emptied from the stomach into the small intestine and then into all succeeding segments of the gut. Most of the muscles of chewing are innervated by the motor branch of the fifth cranial nerve. And the chewing process is controlled by nuclei in the brainstem. Stimulation of specific reticular areas in the brainstem taste centers will cause rhythmic chewing movements. Also, stimulation of areas in the hypothalamus, amygdala, and even the cerebral cortex near the sensory areas for taste and smell can cause chewing. Some fifth cranial nerve, nuclei in the brainstem, reticular areas, hypothalamus, amygdala, and even the cerebral cortex regions in the sensory areas for taste and smell can often cause chewing. The chewing reflex. Most of the chewing process is caused by chewing reflex. Presence of a bolus of food in the mouth. Reflex inhibition of the muscles of mastication. Lower jaw drops initiates a stretch reflex. Rebound contraction raises jaw, closure of teeth. Compress the bolus against the oral lining. Then the reflex inhibition of the muscles of mastication. Swallowing or deglutition. Swallowing is a complicated mechanism, principally because the pharynx subserves respiration and swallowing. The pharynx is covered by only a few seconds at a time into a throat for propulsion of food. It is especially important that respiration not be compromised because of swallowing. So, stages of deglutition. Voluntary stage of swallowing. When the food is ready for swallowing, it is voluntarily squeezed or rolled posteriorly into the pharynx by pressure of the tongue upward. Pressure of the tongue upward and backward against the palate. From here on, swallowing becomes entirely or almost entirely automatic and ordinarily cannot be stopped. So, involuntary pharyngeal stage of swallowing. As the bolus of food enters the posterior mouth and pharynx, it stimulates epithelial swallowing receptor areas all around the opening of the pharynx, especially on the tonsillar pillars, and impulses from these areas pass to the brainstem to initiate a series of automatic pharyngeal muscle contraction as follows. The soft palate is pulled upward to close the posterior nares to prevent a reflux of food into the nasal cavities. The platopharyngeal folds on each side of the pharynx are pulled medially to form a sagittal slit through which the food must pass into the posterior pharynx. Because the stage lasts less than 1 second, any longer object is usually impeded too much to pass into the esophagus. The vocal cords of the larynx are strongly approximated, and the larynx is pulled upward and anteriorly in the neck muscle, and the epiglottis swings backward over the opening of the larynx. These actions prevent passage of food into the nose and trachea. Most essential is the tight approximation of the vocal cords, but the epiglottis helps to prevent food from ever getting as far as the vocal cord. Destruction of the vocal cords or of the muscles that approximate them can cause stagflation. The upward movement of the larynx also pulls up and enlarges the opening to the esophagus. At the same time, the upper 3 to 4 centimeter of esophageal muscular wall, called the upper esophageal sphincter, also called the pharyngoesophageal sphincter. Pharyngoesophageal sphincter relaxes that food moves easily and freely from the posterior pharynx into the upper esophagus. Between swallows, this sphincter remains strongly contracted, thereby preventing air from going into the esophagus during respiration. The upward movement of the larynx also lifts the glottis out of the main stream of the food flow. The food mainly passes on each side of the epiglottis rather than over its surface. This action adds still another protection against the entry of food into the trachea. Once the larynx is raised and the upper esophageal sphincter becomes relaxed, the entire muscular wall of the pharynx contracts, beginning in the anterior part of the pharynx, which then spreads downward over the middle and interior pharyngeal areas, which propels the food by peristalsis into esophagus. To summarize the mechanisms of the pharyngeal phase of swallowing, the trachea is closed, the esophagus is opened, a fast peristaltic wave initiated by the nerve system of the pharynx forces the bolus of food into the upper esophagus. The entire process occurs in less than 2 seconds. Nerves initiation of the pharyngeal stage of swallowing. The most sensitive tactile areas of the process, posterior mouth and pharynx, for initiating the pharyngeal stage of swallowing lie in a ring around the pharyngeal opening, with the greatest sensitivity in the tonsillar pillars. Impulses are transmitted from these areas through the sensory portions of the trigeminal and glossopharyngeal nerves. And also pressure on tonsillar pillars into the medulla oblongata, either into or closely associated with the tractus solitarius, which receives essentially all sensory inputs from the mouth. The successive stages of the swallowing process are then automatically initiated in orderly sequence by neuronal areas of the reticular substance of the medulla and lower portion of the pons. The areas in the medulla and lower pons control swallowing and collectively called deglutition or swallowing center. The motor impulses from the swallowing center or deglutition center to the pharynx and upper esophagus that causes swallowing are transmitted successfully by 5th, 9th, 10th and 11th radial nerves and even a few of the superior radial nerves. In summary, the pharyngeal state of swallowing is principally a reflex act. It is almost always initiated by voluntary movement of food into the back of the mouth, which in turn excites involuntary pharyngeal sensory receptors to elicit the swallowing reflex. An effect of the pharyngeal stage of swallowing and respiration. The entire pharyngeal stage of swallowing usually occurs in less than 6 seconds, thereby interrupting respiration of only a fraction of an unusual respiratory cycle. The swallowing center specifically inhibits the respiratory center of medulla during this time, halting respiration at any point in the cycle to allow swallowing to proceed. Yet even while a person is talking, swallowing interrupts respiration for such a short time that it is hardly noticeable. The esophageal stage of swallowing involves 2 types of peristalsis. The esophagus functions primarily to conduct food rapidly from the pharynx to the stomach, and its movements are organized specifically for this function. The esophagus normally exhibits 2 types of peristaltic movements: primary peristalsis and secondary peristalsis. Primary peristalsis is simply a continuation of the peristaltic waves that begins in the pharynx and spreads into the esophagus during the pharyngeal stage of swallowing. This wave passes all the way from the stomach to the pharynx to the stomach about 8 to 10 seconds. If the primary peristaltic pulse fails to move all the food that has entered the esophagus into the stomach, secondary peristaltic waves result from the retention of the esophagus itself by the retained food. Those waves continue until all the food has emptied into the stomach. The secondary peristaltic waves are initiated partially by intrinsic neural circuits in the mesenteric nervous system and partly to reflexes that begin in the pharynx and are then transmitted upward through the vagal afferent fibers to the medulla and back again into the esophagus through the glossopharyngeal and vagal afferent nerve fibers. Glossopharyngeal and vagal afferent nerve fibers. The musculature of the pharyngeal wall and upper third of the esophagus is striated muscle. Therefore, the peristaltic waves in this region are controlled by skeletal nerve impulses from the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. In the lower two-thirds of the esophagus, the musculature is smooth muscle, but this portion of the esophagus is also strongly controlled by the vagus nerve that acts through the connections in the esophageal meninteric nerve system. Then receptive relaxation of the stomach. When an esophageal peristaltic wave approaches the stomach, a wave of relaxation transmitted through meninteric inhibitory neurons precedes the peristalsis. Furthermore, the entire stomach and to a lesser extent, even the duodenum becomes relaxed as this wave reaches the lower end of the esophagus. Will thus be grouped ahead of the time to perceive the food propelled into esophagus during the swallowing act. Function of the lower esophageal sphincter, gastroesophageal sphincter, at the lower end of the esophagus extending upward from the 3 cm above connection of the stomach is the broad lower esophageal sphincter, also called the gastroesophageal sphincter. This sphincter, consisting of circular muscles, normally remains tonically restricted with an intraluminal pressure of about 30 mmHg. In contrast to the mid portion of the esophagus, is normally remains relaxed. When a peristaltic swallowing wave passes down the esophagus, receptive relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter occurs ahead of the peristaltic wave, which allows easy propulsion of the swallowed food into the stomach. Rarely, the sphincter does not relax satisfactorily, resulting in a condition called achalasia. The chronic contraction of the lower esophageal sphincter helps prevent significant reflux of the acidic stomach contents into the esophagus, except under abnormal conditions. Additional prevention of esophagus reflux by valve-like closure of the distal end of the esophagus. Another factor that helps prevent reflux is a valve-like mechanism of short portion of the esophagus that extends slightly into the stomach. Increased intra-abdominal pressure caves the esophagus inward at this point. This it's like a valve-like closure of the lower esophagus helps to prevent high intra-abdominal pressure from facing stomach contents backward into the esophagus. Otherwise, every time we walked, coughed, or breathed hard, we might expel stomach acid into the esophagus. Next topic, motor functions of the stomach. The motor functions of the stomach are threefold. Storage of large quantities of food until the food can be processed in the stomach, duodenum and lower intestinal tracts. Mixing of these food with the gastric secretions until it forms a semi-fluid mixture called chyme. Slow emptying of the chyme from the stomach into the small intestine at a rate suitable for proper digestion and absorption by the small intestine. Basic anatomy of the stomach. Anatomically, the stomach is usually divided into two major parts, the body and the antrum. Body and the antrum. Physiologically, it is more appropriately divided into a orad portion comprising about the first two-thirds of the body and the caudal portion, odad and caudad portion comprising the remainder of the body plus the antrum. So, esophagus, cardia, fundus, duodenum, pylorus, angular notch, rogate, pyloric sphincter and antrum. These are the major physiological portions of stomach. Then storage function of the stomach. As food enters the stomach, it forms concentric circles of the food in the orad portion of the stomach, with the newest food lying close to the esophageal opening and the oldest food lying near the outer wall of the stomach. Normally, when food touches the stomach, a vagovagal reflex Vagovagal reflex from the stomach to the brainstem and then back to the stomach reduces the tone of the muscular wall of the body of the stomach so that the wall bulges progressively outward, accommodating greater and greater quantities of food up to a limit of completely relaxed stomach of 0.8 to 1.5 liter. The pressure in the stomach remains low until its limit is reached. Mixing and propulsion of food in the stomach, basic electrical rhythm of the stomach wall. As long as food in the stomach, weak peristaltic constrictor waves called mixing waves, begin in the mid to upper portions of the stomach wall and move towards the antrum about once every 15 to 20 seconds. These waves are initiated by the gut wall basic electrical rhythm consisting of electrical slow waves that occur spontaneously in the stomach wall. As the constrictor waves progress from the body of the stomach into the antrum, they become more intense, some become extensively intense and providing powerful peristaltic action potential driven constrictor rings that force the antral contents under higher and higher pressure towards the pylorus. These constrictor rings also play an important role in mixing of the stomach content by digging deeply into the food contents in the antrum. During gastric motility, most of the antral contents are squeezed upstream from the peristaltic ring towards the body of the stomach, not to the pylorus. Thus, the moving peristaltic constrictor ring combined with its upstream squeezing action, retropulsion, is an exceedingly important mixing mechanism in the stomach. After food in the stomach has become thoroughly mixed with the stomach secretions, the resulting mixture that passes down the gut is called chyme. The appearance of chyme is that a milky semifluid or paste. Hunger contractions. Besides the peristaltic contractions that occur when the food is present in the stomach, another type of intense contractions called hunger contractions often occur in the stomach is being empty for several hours or more. These contractions are rhythmic peristaltic contractions in the body of the stomach. Hunger contractions are more intense in young, healthy people who have high degrees of GI tonus. They also greatly increase by the person having lower than normal levels of blood sugar. When hunger contractions occur in the stomach, the person sometimes exhibits mild pain in the pit of the stomach called hunger pangs. Hunger pangs usually do not begin until 12 to 24 hours after the last ingestion of food. In people who are in a state of starvation, they reach their greatest intensity in 3 to 4 days and gradually weaken in succeeding days. When stomach emptying is promoted by intense peristaltic contractions in the stomach antrum. At the same time, emptying is opposed by varying degrees of resistance to passage of chyme in the pylorus. Intense antral peristaltic contractions during stomach emptying, pyloric pump. Most of the time, rhythmic stomach contractions are weak and function mainly to cause mixing of food and gastric secretions. However, for about 20% of time while food is in the stomach, the contractions become intense, beginning in mid-stomach and spreading through the caudal stomach. These contractions are strong peristaltic, very tight ring-like constrictions that can cause stomach emptying. These intense peristaltic contractions often create 50 to 70 centimeters store pressure, which is about 6 times as powerful as the usual mixing type of peristaltic waves. When pyloric tone is normal, each strong peristaltic wave forces up to several milliliters of chyme into the duodenum. Thus, the peristaltic waves, in addition to causing mixing in the stomach, also provides a pumping action called the pyloric pump. Role of the pylorus in controlling stomach emptying. The distal opening of the stomach is the pylorus consists of two circular muscles. It provides slightly tonically contracted almost all the time. Therefore, the pyloric circular muscle is called the pyloric sphincter. Despite normal tonic contraction of the pyloric sphincter, the pylorus usually is open enough for water and other fluids to empty from stomach into the duodenum with ease. The degree of constriction of the pylorus is increased or decreased under the influence of nerves and hormonal signals from both the stomach and the duodenum, as discussed shortly. Regulation of stomach emptying. The rate at which the stomach empties is regulated by signal from both the stomach and duodenum. However, the duodenum provides by far the more important of signals controlling the emptying of chyme into duodenum at a rate no greater than the rate at which the chyme can be digested and absorbed in the small intestine. These feedback inhibitory mechanisms work together to show the rate of emptying when too much chyme is already in the small intestine or the chyme is extensively acidic, contains too much unprocessed protein or fat, is hypotonic or hypertonic, or it's irritating. Factors that regulate gastric emptying are listed. So, powerful duodenal factors that inhibit stomach emptying. Inhibitory factors are inhibitory effect of enterogastric nervous reflexes from the duodenum. When the food enters the duodenum, multiple nerve reflexes are initiated from the duodenal wall. These reflexes are mediated by three routes, directed from duodenum to the stomach through the enteric nervous system in the gut wall, through enteric nerves that go to provertebral sympathetic ganglia, and then back through the inhibitory sympathetic nerve fibers to the stomach, probably to a slight extent through the vagus nerve all the way to the brainstem, where they inhibit the normal excitatory signals transmitted to the stomach through the vagina. All these parallel reflexes have two effects in stomach emptying. First, they strongly inhibit the pyloric pump propulsive contractions, and second, they increase the tone of pyloric sphincter. The types of factors that are continuously monitored in the duodenum and that can initiate enterogastric reflexes are very important. So, hormonal reflexes from duodenum inhibits gastric emptying, role of the fats and the hormone called cytokinin. Besides the nerve reflexes from the duodenum that inhibit stomach emptying, fats entering the duodenum stimulates the inhibitory hormones to be released from the upper intestine. In turn, these hormones are carried by way of blood to the stomach, where they inhibit the pyloric pump and at the same time increase the strength of contraction of the pyloric sphincter. The factors that tend to be monitored in the duodenum, the type of factors that are continuously monitored in the duodenum and that can initiate enterogastric inhibitory reflexes include the following: distension of the duodenum distension, then the presence of any irritation of the duodenal mucosa, acidity of the duodenal chyme, osmolarity of the chyme, then the presence of certain breakdown products in the chyme, especially breakdown products of proteins and perhaps to a lesser extent of fats. The most potent of these hormones appear to be cholecystokinin or CCK, which is released from the mucosa of the jejunum in response to fatty substance from the chyme. Other possible inhibitors of stomach emptying are the hormones secretin and glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, also called gastric inhibitory peptide. Secretin is released mainly from duodenal mucosa in response to gastric acid passed from stomach through the pylorus. GIP is released from the upper small intestine mainly in response to fat in the chyme, but to a lesser extent in response to carbohydrate as well. GIP is in general but weak effect of decreasing GI motility. However, the main effect is physiological concentration of probably mainly due to stimulate secretion of insulin by the pancreas. Movements of the small intestine. The movement of the small intestine, like those elsewhere in the GI tract, can be divided into mixing contractions and the propulsive contractions. To a great extent, the separation is artificial because essentially all movements of the small intestine cause at least some degree of both mixing and propulsion. The usual classification of this process is described in the following section. Mixing contractions, segmentation contractions. When a portion of small intestine becomes distended with chyme, stretching of the intestinal wall elicits localized concentric contractions spaced at intervals along the intestine and lasting a fraction of a minute. The contractions cause segmentation of the small intestine, that is, they divide the intestine into spaced segments that they appear as a chain of sausages. As one set of segmentation contractions relax, a new set often begins, but the contractions this time occur mainly at new points because the previous contractions, therefore the segmentation contractions chop the chyme into 2 to 3 times per minute, in this way promoting progressively mixing of the food with secretions of the small intestine. The maximum frequency of the secretions contractions in the small intestine is determined by the frequency of electrical slow waves in the intestinal wall. Regularly spaced, isolated, regularly spaced, and weak regularly spaced. The maximum frequency of the segmentation contractions in the small intestine is determined by the frequency of electrical slow waves in the intestinal wall, which is about 12 minutes per inverse. But this maximum frequency occurs only under extreme conditions of stimulation. In a terminal ileum, the maximum frequency is usually 8 to 9 contractions per minute. Then propulsive movements. Peristalsis is the small intestine. Peristalsis in the small intestine. Chyme is propelled through the small intestine faster than the proximal intestine and slower in the terminal intestine. Peristaltic waves are normally weak and usually die out after traveling only 3 to 5 centimeters. Movement of the chyme is very slow, so slow that net movement along the small intestine normally averages only 1 centimeter per minute. This rate of travel means that 3 to 4 hours is required for passage of chyme from pylorus to the ileocecal valve. Control of peristalsis by nerves and hormonal signals. Peristaltic activity of the small intestine is greatly increased after a meal. This increased activity is caused partly by the beginning entry of chyme into the duodenum, causing stretch of the duodenal wall. In addition, peristaltic activity is increased by the so-called gastroenteric reflex. Gastroenteric reflex that is initiated by distension of the stomach and conducted principally through the myenteric plexus from the stomach down along the wall of the small intestine. In addition to the nerve signals that may affect small intestinal peristalsis, several hormonal factors also affect peristalsis. These factors include gastrin, colchicine, insulin, mortallin, and serotonin, all of which enhance intestinal motility and are secreted during various phases of food processing. Conversely, secretin and glucagon inhibit intestinal motility. The physiological importance of each of these hormone factors are controlling motility is still questionable. Then propulsive effect of the segmental movements. The segmentation movements, although lasting for only a very few seconds at a time, often also travel 1 centimeter or so in the anal direction, and during that time they help propel the food down the intestine. The differences between the segmentation and the peristaltic movements is not as great as might be implied by their separation into these two classifications. Peristaltic rush. Although peristalsis in the small intestine is normally weak, intense irritation of intestinal mucosa, as occurs in some severe cases of infectious diarrhea, can cause both powerful and rapid peristalsis called peristaltic rush. This phenomenon is initiated partly by nerves reflexes that involve the autonomic nerve system and brainstem, and partly by intrinsic enhancement of the myenteric plexus reflexes within the gut wall. The powerful peristaltic contractions travel long distances in the small intestine within minutes, sweeping the contents of the intestine into colon and thereby relieving the small intestine of irritative chyme and excessive distension. Movements caused by the muscularis mucosa and muscle bundles of villi. The muscularis mucosa can cause short folds to appear in the intestinal mucosa. In addition, individual fibers from this muscle extend into the intestinal villi and cause them to contract intermittently. The mucosal fold increases the surface area exposed to the chyme, thereby increasing absorption. Also, contractions of the villi, shortening, elongating, and shortening again, milk the villi so that lymph flows freely from the lateral lacteals of the villi into the lymphatic system. This mucosal and villous contractions are initiated mainly by local nerves reflexes in the submucosal nerve plexus that occur in response to chyme in the small intestine. The ileocecal valve prevents backflow from the colon to the small intestine. The principal function of the ileocecal valve is to prevent backflow of fecal contents from the colon into the small intestine. Ileocecal valve protrudes into the lumen of the cecum and thereby is forcefully closed when excess pressure builds up in the cecum and tries to push fecal contents backward against the valve lips. The valve usually can resist severe pressure of at least 50 to 60 cm H2. Colon, ileocecal sphincter, valve pressure and chemical irritation relax sphincter and excite peristalsis. Fluidity of contents promote emptying. Ileum, pressure of chemical irritation and cecum inhibits peristalsis of ileum and excites sphincter. The wall of the ileum, for several centimeters immediately upstream from the ileocecal valve, has a thickened circular muscle called ileocecal sphincter that normally remains mildly constricted as slowly emptying the ileum contents into the cecum. Normally only 1,500 to 1000 ml of chyme empties into the cecum each day. Then feedback control of the ileocecal sphincter. The degree of contraction of the ileocecal sphincter and the intensity of peristalsis in the terminal ileum are controlled significantly by reflexes from the cecum. When the cecum is distended, the contraction of the ileocecal sphincters become intensified and ileal peristalsis is inhibited, both of which greatly delay emptying of additional chyme into the cecum from the ileum. Also, any irritant in the cecum delays emptying. For example, the inflamed appendix can cause such intense spasm of the ileocecal sphincter and parietal paralysis of the ileum that these effects together block emptying of the ileum into the cecum. The reflexes from the cecum to the ileocecal sphincter and ileum are mediated both by way of minor reflexes and by the extrinsic autonomic nerves, especially by way of prevertebral sympathetic ganglia. Movement of the colon. The principal functions of the colon are absorption of water and electrolytes from the chyme to form solid feces proximal half of the colon and storage of fecal matter until it can be expelled distal half of the colon. Although the movements in the colon are normally sluggish, they still have characteristics similar to those of the small intestine and can be divided once again into mixing movements and propulsive movements. So mixing movements, hastrations in the same manner that segmentation movements occur in the small intestine, large circular constrictions occur in the large intestine. At each of these constrictions, about 2.5 cm of circular muscle contracts, sometimes constricting the lumen of the colon almost to occlusion. At the same time, the longitudinal muscle of the colon, which is aggregated into 3 longitudinal strips called taeniae coli, contracts. These combined contractions of the circular and longitudinal strips of muscles cause the unestimated portion of the large intestine to bulge outward to bag-like portions called hastrations. Each hastration usually reaches peak intensity in about 30 seconds and then disappears during the next 30 seconds. Therefore, each fecal particle in the large intestine is slowly dug into and rolled over in much the same manner as that one spades the earth. In this way, all the fecal material is gradually exposed to the mucosal surface of the large intestine, and fluid and dissolved substances are progressively absorbed only until 80 to 200 ml of feces are expelled each day. 18 to 200 ml. Then propulsive movements, mass movement. Much of the propulsion of the cecum and ascending colon results from the slow but persistent hastral contractions requiring as many as 8 to 15 hours to move the chyme from the ileocecal valve through the colon, while the chyme becomes fecal in quality. So when we try to learn about the absorption and storage functions of the large intestine, I could see portions like mush, semi-solid, fluid, ileocecal valve, semi-fluid portions. Poor motility causes greater absorption and hard feces in transverse colon cause constipation. From the cecum to the sigmoid, mass movements can for many minutes at a time take over the propulsive role. A mass movement is a modified type of peristaltic characterized by the following sequence of events. A constrictive ring occurs in response to a distended or irritated point in the colon, usually in the transverse colon. Then rapidly the 20 or more centimeters of colon distal to the constrictive ring lose their hastrations or instead contract as a unit, propelling the fetal material in this segment, and then the constipation develops progressively more force for about 30 minutes. Seconds, the relaxation occurs during the next 2 to 3 minutes. Another mass movement then occurs, this time perhaps further along the colon. A series of mass movement usually persists for 10 to 30 minutes. They can cease but return perhaps a half day later. When they have faced a mass of feces into the rectum, the desired fluidification is felt. Initiation of mass movement of gastrocolic and duodenocolic reflexes. The appearance of mass movement after meals is facilitated by gastrocolic and duodenocolic reflexes. These reflexes result from distension of the stomach and duodenum. They occur either not at all or hardly at all when the extrinsic autonomic nerves to the colon have been removed. Therefore, the reflexes are almost certainly are transmitted by way of the autonomic nervous system. Irritation in the colon may also initiate intense mass movements. For instance, a person who has an ulcerated condition of the colon mucosa, ulcerative colitis, frequently has mass movements that persist almost all the time. The next major portion is defecation. Most of the time, the rectum is empty of feces, partly because a weak functional sphincter exists about 20 cm from the anus at the junction between the sigmoid colon and the rectum. A sharp angulation is also present here that contributes additional resistance to filling of the rectum. When a mass movement forces feces into the rectum, a desire for defecation occurs immediately, including reflex contraction of the rectum and relaxation of the anal apertures, sphincters. Continual dribbling of fecal matter through the anus is prevented by tonic constriction of an internal anal sphincter, which is a several centimeter long thickening of a circular smooth muscle that lies immediately inside the anus, or external anal sphincter, composed of a tight voluntary muscle that supports the internal sphincter and extends distal to it. The external sphincter is controlled by nerve fibers in the pudendal nerve, which is part of the somatic nerve system, and therefore is under voluntary, conscious, or at least subconscious control. Subconsciously, the external sphincter is usually kept continuously constricted until subconscious signals inhibit the constriction. Then defecation reflexes. Ordinarily, defecation is initiated by defecation reflexes. There are two types of defecation reflexes. One of these reflexes is an intrinsic reflex mediated by the local enteric nervous system in the rectal wall. Functioning of itself, its reflex normally is relatively weak. Then the parasympathetic defecation reflex. To be effective in causing defecation, the intrinsic reflex usually must be fortified by a parasympathetic defecation reflex that involves the sacral segments of the spinal cord. Fixes into the rectum, distension of the rectal wall. This initiates afferent signals spread through the mesenteric flexus, initiates peristalsis, descending colon, sigmoid and rectum, forcing feces towards the anus. Peristaltic wave approaches anus, internal anus sphincter relaxes. At the same time, if external anus sphincter is voluntarily relaxed, defecation occurs. Nerve entering to the rectum stimulated, signals transmitted to spinal cord, reflex signals via pelvic nerves, descending colon, sigmoid and rectum. Thus, parasympathetic signals travel in the pelvic nerves, greatly intensify peristalsis and relax the internal anal sphincter. At the same time, if external anal sphincter is voluntarily relaxed, defecation occurs. Defecation signals entering the spinal cord initiate another effect, such as taking a deep breath, closure of the glottis, and contraction of the abdominal wall muscles to force the fecal contents of the colon downward, and at the same time they cause the pelvic floor to relax downward and pull outward in the anal ring to evaginate the feces. In newborn babies and in some people with the transected spinal cords, defecation reflexes cause automatic emptying of the lower bowel at inconvenient times during the day because of lack of conscious control of voluntary contraction or relaxation of the external anal sphincter. Then gastrointestinal reflexes. The anatomical arrangement of the enteric nervous system and its connections with the sympathetic and parasympathetic system support three types of GI reflexes that are essential for GI control. They are the following: reflexes that are integrated entirely within the gut wall enteric nerve system. This include reflexes that control much GI secretion, peristalsis, mixing contractions, local inhibitory effects, and so forth. Reflexes from the gut to the perivertebral sympathetic ganglia and then back to the GI tract. These reflexes transmit long distance signals to other areas of GI tract, such as signals from the stomach to cause evacuation of the colon, the gastrocolic reflex, signals from the colon and small intestine to inhibit stomach motility and stomach secretion, the enterogastric reflex, and reflex from the colon to inhibit emptying of ileal contents into the colon. Proloimeal reflex, reflexes from the gut to the spinal cord to brainstem and then back to the GI tract. This includes especially reflexes from the stomach and duodenum of the brainstem and back to the stomach by way of vagus nerve to control gastric motor and secretory activity. Pain reflexes that cause general inhibition of the enteric GI tract, and defecation reflexes that travel from the colon and rectum to the spinal cord and back again to produce the powerful colonic, rectal, and abdominal contractions required for defecation reflexes. Other autonomic reflexes that affect bowel activity. Aside from duodenocolic, gastrocolic, gastrolinic, enterogastric, and defecation reflexes that have been discussed in this chapter, several other important nerve reflexes also affect the overall degree of bowel activity. They are the peritoneointestinal reflex, reno-intestinal reflex or reno-intestinal reflex, and the vesico-intestinal reflex. The peritoneointestinal reflex results from irritation of the peritoneum. It strongly inhibits the excitatory enteric nerves and thereby can cause intestinal peristalsis, especially in patients with peritonitis. The retinointestinal and vesicointestinal reflexes inhibit intestinal activity as a result of kidney or bladder irritation.